0 days. 0. That's how many days Weston's income survived without him at 24. Not a metaphor. An actual number he started tracking, almost by accident, after a stomach bug knocked him flat for 36 hours, and he watched his own paycheck stop as cleanly as a faucet being turned off. Weston was an HVAC technician, good at what he did, booked solid most weeks, fixing furnaces and condenser units across a mid-sized city, driving a van with his name misspelled on the side panel because the sign shop had rushed the order and nobody ever bothered to fix it. The work paid well, $41,000 a year at 24, climbing steadily, and every dollar of it required Weston, specifically, physically, on a ladder or under a unit doing the work. Miss a day, lose a day. Get sick, get nothing. The income and the man were essentially the same thing. You couldn't separate them without both stopping. He didn't have a name for this yet. He just had the stomach bug, the blank space in his bank app where a normal day's earnings should have shown up, and the beginning of a question he wouldn't be able to answer for years. What would actually happen to the money if he simply disappeared? He remembers lying on his bathroom floor at one point that day, too wrung out to make it back to the couch, thinking, with the strange clarity illness sometimes produces, that somewhere across the city, his scheduled jobs were quietly being reassigned to someone else, or simply not happening at all. Either way, nothing about his bank balance was going to notice or care that he existed. The company would be fine. His customers would reschedule. Only his own number would sit there, unmoved, unearned, exactly where it had been the day before. That thought stayed with him longer than the stomach bug did, the number that started following him. He started running the question quietly, almost as a private joke with himself. Say he disappeared. No note, no explanation, just gone. How many days would his money keep arriving before it noticed he was missing? At 24, the honest answer was 0. The job paid for hours worked, full stop. There was no lag, no buffer, no version of the system that kept functioning without him standing inside it. At 26, he picked up side work, evenings and weekends, servicing units for a property management company under a private contract. More money. Also, still 0. If Weston vanished, the units still needed servicing, the contract still needed a technician, and the phone still needed a person attached to the number who could actually show up. He'd simply built a second version of the exact same dependency. Different client, same math. His coworker Desmond, hearing Weston explain the whole disappear number idea over lunch one day, laughed and said it sounded like a fancy way of saying he wanted to get paid for doing nothing, which wasn't exactly wrong and also wasn't exactly the point. Weston didn't want to do nothing. He wanted the money to survive a version of his life where something happened to him that he didn't choose. Those turned out to be very different ambitions, even if they sounded identical from across a lunch table. Around then, he read something that reorganized the way he saw the whole picture. Robert Kiyosaki's popular framing draws a blunt line between an asset and a job. An asset puts money in your pocket whether or not you personally show up, while a job, including a business you're personally required to run, stops the moment you stop. Weston had assumed, the way most people do, that working harder and working for himself were the same category of progress. They weren't. He'd built a second job, not a second income source that could survive him. That distinction, once he actually saw it, was uncomfortable in a very specific way. It meant nearly a decade of hustle hadn't moved him 1 inch closer to independence. It had just added another shift. The business that lied about being passive. At 27, Weston made his first real attempt at fixing this, and it went badly, which turned out to matter more than any of the things that later went well. A guy he'd met at a trade conference was selling what he called a turnkey online retail business, a storefront already built, a supplier relationship already negotiated, and a product line already selling a modest but steady volume. $8,000, most of what Weston had managed to save beyond his emergency fund. The pitch used the word passive 4 times in one conversation. Weston counted afterward, once it was too late for the counting to matter. It was not passive. Within 3 weeks, a shipment arrived with the wrong size, and Weston spent an evening on the phone with the supplier trying to fix it himself because there was no one else attached to the business who would. Customers emailed about broken items, and those emails came straight to Weston's inbox because he was, in every practical sense, the business now, regardless of what the sales pitch had called it. He was paying storage fees on unsold units sitting in a warehouse he'd never visited, watching that number climb every month whether he did anything or not. That is its own bitter kind of independence, a cost that runs without you rather than an income that does. He kept it for 11 months. In that time, it consumed something close to 15 hours a week of his attention and returned, after all expenses, a little over $400 total for the entire stretch. He sold his stake to another buyer at a modest loss, mostly out of exhaustion, and walked away having learned something the sales pitch had never once mentioned. The word passive, attached to a product for sale, should be treated as a claim to be tested, not a fact to be trusted. Nobody selling you passivity has any obligation to have actually built it. The $8,000 stung for a while. What stung longer was realizing he'd spent a year chasing the exact opposite of what he'd set out to find, dressed up in the one word that should have made him more careful, not less. And that mistake gave him a filter he hadn't had before. The first real asset and how small it felt. At 29, Weston bought his first index fund shares, a modest few $1,000s pulled from savings he'd been treating as an emergency cushion for years without ever touching. Nothing dramatic, no fanfare. He didn't tell anyone, mostly because the amount felt too small to mention out loud, and partly because he was still a little embarrassed about the $8,000 from 2 years earlier. But something had genuinely changed, even if the dollar figure hadn't. That money, small as it was, didn't need Weston to do anything. It didn't care if he was sick, traveling, asleep, or furious at a customer who wouldn't pay an invoice. The dividends would post whether he showed up to anything or not. For the first time in his adult life, some portion of his money, a small, almost embarrassing portion, could survive his absence completely and do it without pretending to be something it wasn't. He started keeping a private note on his phone, just for himself, tracking what he began calling his disappear number, the number of days his current income could survive if he genuinely vanished, no explanation, nobody covering for him. At 29, factoring in the dividend income against his actual monthly expenses, the honest number was still close to zero, because the dividend money was real, but tiny, a rounding error against his rent. He'd built something structurally different. It just wasn't big enough yet to matter. Structurally different and practically irrelevant can both be true about the same asset at the same time. That's a harder thing to sit with than either one alone, and it's exactly the stretch where most people quit. Because a technically correct asset that changes nothing about your actual life doesn't feel like progress. It feels like being patient for the sake of being patient, with no proof yet that the patience is going anywhere. But Weston kept going. The storage units, and the part he got wrong first. At 31, Weston bought 2 units in a self-storage facility on the edge of town, using a modest inheritance from a grandmother he'd barely gotten to know as an adult. He rented them out within 3 weeks, $600 a month combined, arriving automatically. He remembers feeling, briefly, like he'd solved something in a way that felt different from the index fund, bigger and more tangible, something you could point to on a map. He hadn't, not entirely. 6 months in, 1 unit flooded during a hard spring rain, and the tenant called Weston directly at 11 at night, furious and expecting him to personally handle it. Weston drove out in the rain himself because he didn't yet have anyone else set up to handle it, and stood ankle-deep in a storage unit at midnight, moving someone else's water-damaged boxes. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he'd built an asset or just a smaller, wetter version of his old job, with a landlord's headaches instead of a technician's. That night taught him something the index fund hadn't needed to. An asset that pays you but still calls you at midnight isn't truly independent. It's semi-independent, which is a different and much less useful category. So he hired a local property manager for both units, a flat monthly fee that ate into the profit but removed Weston from the phone entirely. The income dropped from $600 a month to closer to $480. The disappear number for those 2 units specifically went from roughly 3 days, the time before something would break badly enough to need him personally, to something closer to indefinite, as long as the manager kept doing her job. He'd paid, in effect, for his own absence. It was the first time in his life that spending money had made him more free rather than less. And it was a strange enough sensation that he mentioned it to Desmond again months later, half expecting to be laughed at a second time. Desmond didn't laugh this time. He just asked how much the property manager cost and whether she had room for one more client. That was the first time Weston realized that delegation wasn't failure. Sometimes it was the mechanism that made an asset independent. The laundromat, and why it almost didn't happen. At 33, Weston bought a small stake in a coin laundromat with 2 other investors, people he'd met through the property manager, oddly enough. He almost didn't do it. The laundromat industry, from a distance, looks like exactly the kind of business that needs a person standing in it. Machines breaking, coins jamming, someone mopping the floor. His HVAC instincts told him this was another job wearing an asset's clothing, the same shape as the $8,000 mistake from 6 years earlier, just with different machinery. What actually convinced him was a conversation with one of the other investors, a woman named Priscilla, who'd been in the laundromat business for 11 years and ran the numbers with him at her kitchen table, patiently, the way someone explains something they've stopped finding complicated a long time ago. Modern coin laundries, done right, are mostly self-managing, card-based payment systems instead of coin jams, remote monitoring that alerts a technician only when a specific machine actually fails, and a part-time attendant covering a few scheduled hours a week, rather than someone stationed there full-time. The Coin Laundry Association's own industry surveys describe well-run laundromats as some of the lowest labor retail businesses around, precisely because the customer does almost all the actual work themselves. Weston, of all people, understood machines. He didn't need to run the location. He needed the location to run itself, and only call him when a machine failed in a way the remote system couldn't handle. He put in $11,000 for a minority stake. The first year, it threw off around $2,200 to him personally, on top of the storage units and the growing index fund position. Small, again, but the disappear number for this piece, by his own honest accounting, was somewhere north of 90 days. A machine could break. The attendant could handle scheduling. Weston might not even hear about most of it until the monthly statement arrived. The one time a dryer's heating element failed, the remote monitoring flagged it, and a repair technician Priscilla kept on retainer had it fixed before Weston even saw the alert on his phone. He noticed the pattern now. The less the asset needed him, the more valuable it became to him. The test he didn't plan to run. At 35, the test happened without Weston choosing the timing, which turned out to matter more than any test he could have designed on purpose. His father had a medical emergency out of state, sudden and serious enough that Weston left within a day and stayed for 6 weeks, barely checking a phone that wasn't ringing about anything except family. He didn't think about the disappear number once during those 6 weeks. He was thinking about his father, about hospital corridors that all smell the same, regardless of which state you're in, about a version of fear that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with a man who taught him how to use a wrench, now lying very still in a bed with tubes running into his arm. It was only afterward, back home and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, that he opened his accounts, out of habit more than curiosity, almost apologetically, as if checking on something he felt guilty for having neglected. The index fund had grown modestly, the way markets do regardless of who's watching them. The storage units had generated their usual $480 a month, twice, without a single call to Weston's phone. The laundromat had thrown off its usual distribution on schedule, with one line in the monthly report noting a coin mechanism replaced on a machine Weston had never even seen in person. Nobody had needed him. Nobody had known he was gone, at least in the sense that mattered financially. The money had simply kept doing what it was built to do, while the actual, non-negotiable emergency of his life unfolded somewhere else entirely, on a different, harder ledger that no dividend statement could touch. He didn't feel triumphant reading that. He felt something quieter and stranger. Relief that the money, for once in his life, hadn't been one more thing demanding his attention during the 6 weeks it mattered least. His father, slowly, got better. That part had nothing to do with any asset. But the fact that Weston could sit in a hospital hallway for 6 straight weeks without a second financial emergency stacking on top of the first one, that part had everything to do with it. Sitting there, he understood that this was probably the entire point of the last 11 years, even though he hadn't been building toward this specific hallway when he started. The HVAC income, over those same 6 weeks, had of course simply stopped. A friend covered 2 emergency calls as a favor. Everything else went to voicemail. That gap, the one thing that still genuinely needed him physically present, was the one part of his financial life that couldn't survive an emergency without either his presence or someone else's charity. Weston noticed the contrast without needing anyone to point it out to him. What the number actually looked like by 37. By 37, Weston's disappear number, calculated honestly against his actual monthly expenses, had reached nearly 110 days. Not infinite, not enough on its own to fully replace the HVAC income yet, but real and growing in a direction the HVAC work never could, because the HVAC work's disappear number would be 0 on his last working day, exactly as it had been 0 on his first. He still worked the HVAC job. He mostly liked it. The money was good, and there was no version of this story where he quit dramatically to live off dividends and a laundromat stake. That wasn't what changed. What changed was the shape of his attention. He stopped treating every dollar of income as functionally identical. A dollar that required his physical presence went into one mental account. A dollar that didn't went into another, and only the second kind counted toward the actual number he cared about. That distinction became harder to ignore once he started seeing how much of his income depended on him simply showing up. He also stopped being impressed by side hustles that paid well but still needed him personally every week, much like he'd once been impressed by his own contract work at 26, and the way he'd been genuinely fooled by a word on a sales page at 27. Good income, independent income, and income that merely claimed to be independent turned out to be 3 separate categories. And most financial advice, he noticed, only ever bothered to distinguish between the first 2. Desmond, incidentally, took Priscilla up on the property manager referral, bought a single storage unit of his own at 34, and still brings it up at lunch sometimes, usually to complain, good-naturedly, that Weston never once mentioned the $8,000 mistake until years after the fact. Weston's answer is always the same. He wasn't ready to talk about the version of himself who had gotten fooled by his own favorite word until he'd built enough of the real thing to feel less embarrassed standing next to it. And, in a strange way, that was probably the point. The mistake became easier to look at once he had something real to compare it against. What this actually means and what it doesn't. This isn't an argument for never working or for treating a good job like something beneath you. Weston's HVAC income funded every asset in this story, including the failed one. Without the 0-day job, there would have been no $8,000 to lose, no index fund, no storage units, and no laundromat stake. Active income isn't the enemy here, it's the raw material. The mistake is mistaking it for the finished structure, and the second mistake, the one that costs actual money rather than just time, is mistaking someone else's sales pitch for the finished structure too. That's an important distinction, because building something real is usually much less exciting than being promised something real. It's also not a promise that passive assets are easy or hands-off from day one. The flooded storage unit at midnight was real. The failed online retail business was real, expensive, and took 11 months to admit it wasn't working. The years when the dividend income was too small to matter were real too. Every functioning asset in this story took money, time, and at least one uncomfortable lesson before it actually behaved the way an asset is supposed to behave. Independence, it turns out, has to be built the same slow way everything else does. It doesn't arrive pre-assembled just because someone sold it to you using the right word. What actually shifted for Weston wasn't the total dollar figure. It was the question he started asking before spending or investing anything at all. If I vanished tomorrow, would this specific dollar still show up? And would it show up because of a genuine structure or because someone told me it would? Most of his money for most of his life would have answered no to the first question and yes to the second, without him ever checking the difference. A slowly growing portion of it now answers yes to both, and that portion is the only part of his balance sheet he actually thinks of as wealth in the strictest sense of the word. That was the number that mattered to him now. Not how much he earned, but how much of what he earned could keep working when he couldn't. A closing thought from someone who never saw a dividend statement. There's an old argument buried in Aristotle's Politics that most people never encounter outside a philosophy syllabus. Aristotle drew a sharp, disapproving line between household management, the ordinary business of earning a living through labor and trade, and what he called krematistike, wealth accumulated by lending money at interest so that the money itself generated more money without any further labor attached to it. He considered the second kind unnatural. Money, in his view, was meant to be a tool for exchange, not something that bred more of itself while its owner did nothing. He wasn't wrong about the mechanism. He was simply standing on the opposite side of an argument that took 2,000 years to fully turn over. The exact quality Aristotle found suspicious in interest-bearing money, that it keeps producing value while its owner is doing something else entirely, sleeping, traveling, sitting at a hospital bedside 3 states away, is precisely the quality modern personal finance spends its whole vocabulary trying to build on purpose. What one era called unnatural, a later one quietly renamed independence. It's worth noticing, too, that Aristotle would have had no patience at all for the $8,000 mistake, though probably for the opposite reason. He'd have recognized it instantly, not as krematistike, but as ordinary labor wearing a disguise, a business that demanded exactly the kind of hands-on daily management he considered normal and necessary, sold to Weston using a word that promised something the business had never actually been built to deliver. The old philosopher who distrusted money that worked without labor might have had considerably more sympathy for the version of the story where Weston got fooled than for the version where he eventually succeeded. And maybe that's the uncomfortable lesson hiding underneath all of it. Sometimes the most expensive financial mistake isn't losing money. It's believing you've bought freedom when you've actually bought yourself another job. Weston never read Aristotle. He read A Stomach Bug and a Blank Space in a Bank App at 24, an $8,000 invoice for a business that was never what it claimed to be at 27, and built the rest of it out of storage units, laundry machines, and a stubborn little number on his phone that he kept honest, year after year, whether it was flattering or not.